This is a proof of concept experiment that we did back in 2018 to find out whether it was possible to duplicate the dexterity test mentioned in Saracen Archery. I'll read the original description to give you some idea of where we were coming from. First of all, chapter 25, section 4 talked about on determining whether an arrow is fast or slow. To do this, you stand still and aim at a mark 60 bows distance away, about 75 yards, and then shoot. From the moment the arrow leaves the bow till the time it drops at the mark, you count. If by then you have counted 6, your performance is average. If you count less, your shaft is fast. If you count more, it's slow. Now you can see that this is not a really good way of gauging arrow speed. I mean, Arabic numbers usually have more than one syllable, unlike English numbers, so they take a little bit longer to say. So the time we would say in English 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's a fraction of a second or more longer when you say it in Arabic, assuming you say it at a regular pace and all these other things that you have to make assumptions about. When Latham and Patterson, the authors of the translation, decided to look at this, they didn't really say very much about that because it was clearly not very useful. However, on page 138 in section 6 there is another description of a dexterity test called "On Ensuring a Low Trajectory." For this purpose you take 2 staves, each of the height to which you can reach, and then you set them up 5 cubits apart across the centre of a short range. They use the word ulki for short range. Then you take a rope, fasten it to them, and shoot. If your arrows fly under the rope to the mark, their trajectory is sufficiently low, lati. Whereas if they go over it, their trajectory is too high, motafi. This is a pretty good measure because you can actually replicate this. And what Latham and Patterson did in their comments was they calculated how fast an arrow would have to go under the rope. Now, they estimated that the rope would have to be about 8 feet high, guessing that was the height that an average man would be able to reach. I'm not sure how accurate that is. I haven't seen anything about heights among the Mamluks, and of course there's no guarantee that this section in Taibuka was actually written in Mamluk Egypt. It could be a quotation from something else. He does that all the time. But they say this in their comments: the height of the rope across the centre of the range would be about 8 feet, though we must allow for a margin of on either side because the measurement is based on human stature, which is variable. Given the data suggested, it would be found that a man kneeling or squatting must discharge his arrow at not less than 180 feet per second if it is to hit the target on the ground at 75 yards with a trajectory not exceeding 8 feet in height. Then they give a calculated time of flight of 1.5 seconds. Now this is pretty good. The way they would have done this, they would have used a ballistic coefficient and calculated on a guess of the drag of the arrow what would produce the appropriate parabola of flight trajectory. This is reasonably accurate, but there are 2 guesses in there. One is the major one, the one we'll talk about, is the drag of the arrow. Drag is a variable quantity. the faster the object goes, the more drag it has without changing shape. The slower it goes, the less drag. The more massive it is, the less effect the drag has on it. So there was a bit of guesswork here, but as we'll see later, it wasn't that bad. What I'm doing here in shooting the whistling arrows, I'm holding them in my drawing hand because they don't fit in the quiver. This type of whistling head is modelled on a Chinese and Mongolian one, which were designed for different quivers used in the Qing dynasty. These arrows have very low fletching, and you will see that despite that and an initial wobble when they take off, they go reasonably straight. This arrow actually touches the rope as it goes under it. You can just see it move. I was aiming at the center of the rope, trying to get the arrows to get as close to the rope as possible. All arrows went under the rope. It's not entirely obvious watching on the video because of contrast issues. The bright sunlight and the dark shadows tend to make the arrows disappear when they get close to the rope, but I could clearly see them. And I had someone standing behind me that confirmed these. This is shot at 120 frames per second, and as a result the movement in the trees and that you see is considerably slower than it really was. There was a strong crosswind, and that accounts for some of the peculiarities in the first part of the flight of the arrows. They all straightened out before they reached the rope. In fact, most of them straightened out before they got to the dip right in front of me there. But because we're using a wide angle lens to make everything stay in focus, there is the closer to the camera, horizontal distances are magnified. Further away they're minimized because it's just the way optics work. So it does make it look as though it's going really crazy when you first take off, but it didn't actually look like that. It did in fact move. I mean, this is accurate, but it's not a reflection of the geometrics in the real world because it's amplified close to the camera and reduced further away. However, still, the arrows were being affected by the wind, but they straightened out, and once they did that, they stopped being affected. You will see later on that you can actually see the arrows curving around the bow in some of the stills we extracted from this video. What surprised me was that shooting like this was actually accurate, because the target wasn't very big. It was approximately 60 centimeters tall and about 30 centimeters. Oh no, not that much. It was probably only about 20 centimeters wide. All the arrows fell close to it, and so we were, I'm quite pleased with that. There wasn't anything marking the center of the rope, so that was all estimation, and it's not entirely clear from this where the arrows go under the rope. My best estimate is that they were only a few inches under the rope, except for the one that actually touched it. The rope stayed perfectly straight. We didn't have any sag in it, so that was a very good indicator of the height of the arrow at that point. I mean, there are some things that might cause problems without actually having performed the calculations, which we'll do when we set this up on a flat surface. It's hard to tell whether the parabola of the trajectory actually is higher after the rope and then drops down. It probably is, but it might only be a very small variation. And you will see the object fall over when it gets hit by the arrow. The arrow embedded itself in the target. I was using hex blunts because I didn't want to lose my arrows in the grass. Obviously, if you're shooting at a target on the ground, you've got problems. because the arrow is coming in almost parallel to ground level and it will burrow under the grass. You might say, well, you could make adjustments, make the rope higher, but I had to put the rope up by myself and I'm not that tall. So as a result, it was easier to go for the height that was mentioned in Saracen Archery rather than try and do something more complicated. These profile views were basically show how high you need to elevate the arrow to hit a target on the ground at 70 yards. That's not very high with this bow. My experience is that modern Korean bows made for traditional Korean archery in modern materials perform very well, and I've always been happy using them. You'll see that the large whistle on the front of the arrow reduces its draw length. Inside that whistle is a steel blunt screwed into the carbon arrow, which then fits into the front part of the whistle, so there's at least an inch shortening in draw length, and that's reflected in the velocities. The hex blunts, which can be drawn further, we're getting velocities up around 177 feet per second. I measured these exact arrows later, so that we have some kind of comparison. The whistling arrows only did 144, which is quite incredible considering how big those heads were. But they, whistling arrows have a long history, and they are often used in specific types of target competition, so it's not surprising that they perform well. And these plastic Chinese ones are pretty accurate representations of horn whistling arrows. I've got an old one, and it's same number of holes, almost the same diameter, almost the same length. The general profiles are pretty much the same, so they're pretty close to the real thing. You'll see that again, there's very little difference needed in elevation. The whistling arrowheads, once we got the velocity, we realised they weren't hitting next to the target, because when we found them, they were laying next to the target or just beyond it. It seems that they were hitting the ground in front of the target and sliding up to it and stopping. They're very good at sliding on grass, so that's quite reasonable. The hex blunts, of course, caught the ground as soon as they hit it, and they were peppered all around the target. In this last round, I hit the target again. It fell over, and then the next arrow cut the first arrow in half, just above the start of the arrow wrap on it. So that was unexpected. It does mean that aiming at the center of the rope gave a very good control of horizontal drift in aiming, but it's not. I'm not a great archer. I might know a few techniques, but that if you don't practice regularly, you just don't. You don't keep your skill. It goes away until you start practicing again. So the conclusion we came to, we didn't need the 180 feet per second or need to kneel down to shoot to get under the rope. My guess is that they had a much higher drag coefficient than probably was necessary for the arrows that would have been used at the time. Carbon arrows are quite thin. You might say they don't perform like wooden arrows, but they do perform like reed arrows, and I've got reed arrows that are stiff enough to shoot out of 90-pound bows that are a little over 6.5 millimeters in diameter. So it's the Mamluks did use wooden arrows, but I don't think there was enough variation to cause too much problems. So I'd say this test worked. Thank you very much.